12 years ago, Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire were released on the Game Boy Advance and became two of the best all-time bestsellers for the console. Since their release, fans of the Pokemon franchise have wanted a remake of these beloved titles, and earlier this year in May, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire were announced to an eagerly awaiting public. But were they worth the wait? Let's find out, shall we?
Audio Jungle. Audio Jungle. Audio Jungle. Audio Jungle.
Hello again, and how are we all? Okay, so this review went a week longer than I originally planned it to be because, admittedly, I did get a little bit of writer's block. But enough about that, let's move on. So last time I took a look at Pokemon Y and Pokemon X. And this time around, as I said earlier, we're going to be taking a look at Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. So let's just dive right in and get started. Okay, first of all, the story. To those of you who are familiar with the original Ruby and Sapphire, the story presented in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire won't come as a surprise to you, largely from them being remakes. You're a kid who's just moved into the region of Hoenn, where your father has just took up the position of a gym leader. After meeting your neighbour, either Brandon or May, depending on who you choose to play as, you'll meet Professor Birch being chased around by a wild Pokemon while out doing some field work. And from here you choose your Pokemon and get into your first battle. So it kind of breaks away from the original Pokemon formula where you go into a lab and meet your rival there. And adventure-wise, you go from there, you start your Pokemon adventure, you go out into the world to catch and train Pokemon, earn badges at all the gyms, prove yourself as a trainer, beat the Elite Four and become the champion, while stopping either Team Aqua or Team Magma from realising their plans. But of course, with these being remakes, there are some differences in these updated versions. Like in X and Y, Mega Evolutions do play a bigger part in the narrative, whereas in X and Y, we were only told a vague bit of information about Mega Evolutions. With Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, what they try to bring is more of an origin to Mega Evolutions. And they do this by including a new type of evolution which is exclusive to the legendaries in Hoenn, Groudon and Kyogre, Primal Reversion, and this is somehow linked to Mega Evolution. I'm not going to spoil it in that regard because it is interesting to kind of delve into. Another addition with Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire is the Delta episode, which, like the Looker Bureau in X and Y, it adds a last chapter to the main story, and it does tie in some elements of Emerald. So for those of you who were looking for a little bit of that, we've got a bit of Emerald in here. The Delta episode introduces us to Xena, a mysterious woman, and she holds the key to the Delta episode storyline. Looking at it as a whole, without spoiling anything, it does carry a story that's worth caring for within this narrative, and I gotta be honest, the execution was way better than I personally expected, and I hope that Game Freak continue this trend in any future Pokemon releases. Another thing that these games excel in is in character development, by adding in new changes in animation, which make the cast ultimately more dynamic as a whole, and it adds more to the more intricate storyline being presented here in Aurus. Okay, quickly onto the graphics. The graphical bump to 3D that we saw in X and Y is back here in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, but I've been far more impressed with the world of Hoenn than I ever was with the region of Kalos. The art is more brighter and is much more lively, with its locations feeling strangely more fresh than I would have thought given the age of both Ruby and Sapphire. Many of Ruby and Sapphire's characters are now far more expressive and emotional, and while this is often played up for laughs, it does give the cast a whole personality and style which they lacked in the previous games. There is one part where the graphics are at their most breathtaking, and that is when you call on either Latios or Latias, depending on what version you play as, and using the Soar ability. The Soar ability allows you to ride said Pokemon in a third-person perspective, and it allows you to fly to every corner of Hoenn, even the islands that you couldn't reach in the original games. And the view of Hoenn while doing this is an incredible thing to look at. And the freedom of movement you get with the Soar ability will more than likely render the Fly Hidden Machine, or HM, pointless in the grand scheme of things. Okay, on to the music. One of the reasons why the original Ruby and Sapphire stood out from its previous games in the franchise was the music. The approach that Aurus took with its soundtrack is that it tries to be faithful while also trying to make the music fit the situation more. In general, the remixes capture the essence of the original soundtrack while amplifying the feeling, ambience, and the overall tone. They add charm to the world and enrich the atmosphere, while preserving the feeling and tone the original tracks had. That being said, however, every now and again you'll run into one or two music tracks that sound a little bit off. The differences are really subtle in this regard, and so some of the added tones detract from the melody and dilute the sharp feeling the originals had. Overall, the soundtrack is pretty outstanding here in Aurus. Quickly onto the features of Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. A lot of the features are essentially a copy of the ones seen in X and Y, which makes sense because all four games shared a development. But it would have been great if they had a degree of unique flair to X and Y and Aurus design-wise to differentiate them from each other. The problem is these features are hidden in the interface in Aurus, which can lead players forgetting that they're even there. One of the biggest additions in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire is the Dex Nav. This makes it easier for trainers looking for particular Pokemon, and these can have certain moves, stats, or abilities that they don't normally have. And the inclusion of the PSS and those features improve on the restrictive trading that was found in the original Ruby and Sapphire by integrating that with the systems used by X and Y, which make for a smoother online experience in either trading or battling with other players across the world, which allows players to determine what their experience in Aurus is going to be. In the original Ruby and Sapphire, you were pretty much stuck with the Pokemon exclusive to those games. There was no backwards compatibility. So they've addressed that issue. Like I said, the experience is up to the user. If they want it to be closer to the original Ruby Sapphire, you can stick with the Pokemon that you have exclusive in those games, or you can integrate Pokemon from X and Y through the Pokebank for a more customized team. Another fresh feature in Aurus is it's an extension on the Fly HM. Similar to the Soar ability, you can now access routes as well as towns and points of interest, like in previous generations. Onto a little bit on the drawbacks of these two games. The first would have to be the story writing. Now, what I mean by this is that there are some parts in the story that worked in the original Game Boy Advance games, but they seem dated in these newer remakes. One example of this is when your character, whoever you choose to be, meets your father, Norman, and some of the dialogue would suggest that Norman himself is somewhat distant when read today, which makes him as a character come off as not really interested in you, but is more encouraging towards Wally, a shy and frail trainer who's just starting out, who later becomes your rival alongside either Brandon or May. Of course, this can be read that way, but also the whole distant thing, it might just be that you don't need that kind of encouragement, but Wally does because he's always second guessing himself. Now on to the abundance of HMs. This is one thing that these games do get a minus against. While being necessary for exploring a diverse landscape like Hoenn, it's a double edge to these being faithful remakes, which means you've got to have at least 2 Pokemon so you can use a total of all 8, 4 per Pokemon for the sake of progression. And this is going to annoy some players, I'm not going to lie, I've experienced that frustration myself. But there is a plus side to the HM issue. The Pokemon Sharpedo now has a faster swimming speed while using Surf, so traversing the water heavy areas is much better this time round if you feel that Hoenn has too much water. The next issue is the lack of the Battle Frontier. Personally, like many others, I was surprised that the Battle Frontier was not immediately included in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, leaving only a model version and saying it was coming soon during the post-game. I've got to put a spoiler disclaimer at the beginning of this video. Ultimately, this gives the impression that it's going to come later through downloadable content, but it is missed. Instead, they give us the Battle Maison, which is alright, but it's not the Battle Frontier. Now is more of a personal issue I've had with Aurus. Now, when I played from the beginning, right way through the 5 first gyms, it felt more like a tutorial than the challenging climb I remember. So, the lack of challenge kind of bugged me in a way. Okay, quickly now on to my final thoughts. I did have high standards for these remakes in how they would be crafted and how they could improve on the older mechanics, as well as the storytelling and characters, while improving on the games being remade enough to justify me having to play through them again. In the past, Game Freak has proven with Heart Gold and Soul Silver that remakes of older Pokemon games can do just that, and I'm happy to say that Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire succeed in this regard. From the introduction to the ending credits, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire are fantastic reintroductions to Hoenn for both players of the originals and new players alike. While they are not perfect games, they do hit the mark needed for a remade title, and the strengths of the more modern Pokemon games have been used well to improve on the style that the originals had while keeping the overall feeling of the games intact. Okay, before I round off this review, I just want to talk about some of the stuff you got when you pre-ordered the game. On one hand, in America, I think you got some keychains or something. Here in the UK, we got either a steelbook or we got another edition with the figures. I got the figures. To be honest, I like the way some steelbooks look, but overall, I'm not really a fan of steelbooks. I mean, they look nice, but they're bigger and bulky. Anyway, I've got the figures right here. I haven't opened them yet. Seriously, they've been sat on my desk since I got them on the 28th of November. Anyway, for those of you who might be interested, I'm opening these just for you guys. Alrighty then, let's start with Groudon. Here we go, Primal Groudon. Let's see if we can get... Actually, for a figure like this, it's actually quite well detailed. And I know that's meant to be magma that Groudon is standing on. I still say it looks like a cookie or something. But that's just me. Personally, I do like the way these primal reversion forms look, although I favour Groudon over Kyogre. Right, that's one figure done. Let's see Groudon, shall we? Now, after this video, these are going to be my desktop companions, shall we say. There we go. So, you've seen Groudon, here's Kyogre. Now, one thing I have to kind of complain about is I was lucky. Some people that pre-ordered these games, you know, exclusively for the figures, didn't get them because here in the UK at some game shops they didn't get enough in stock. So if anyone from Nintendo comes across this video, there are some people that are still waiting for their figures. A friend of mine got her Groudon, but she didn't get her Kyogre. Come on, Nintendo. So there's my little review of Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. I just want to say thank you very much for watching, and until next time, see ya!
Audio Jungle. Audio Jungle.